Hi guys, I hope you're well. So in my last episode I talked about and ranked the best and worst horror movies of 2021 that I had watched, and in today's episode I'm doing something a little bit similar, but this time I'm talking about my top 10 movies of 2021, and this is including both horror and non-horror. If you didn't already know, I don't just love horror movies, I love thrillers and action, sci-fi, fantasy, superhero, all that good stuff, and I wanted to be able to share some love for the non-horror movies that I watched last year as well as the horror. So I know that the title says I'm talking about my top 10 movies of 2021, but I'll be honest, there are actually 11 on this list because as hard as I tried, I could not whittle it down to 10. But hey, it means you get 11 movies for the price of 10. These are all movies that I absolutely loved, so these are not ranked, these are in no particular order, but at the end of the episode I will list my top 5 of the year. So first up we have Malignant by James Wan, which I think might have been the most polarising movie of the year, especially in the horror community. People either seem to really love it or really hate it. There was very little middle ground. But I loved Malignant. I loved how outrageous and unpredictable it was, and I think that it was my favourite viewing experience of the year. I was laughing, I was jumping out of my skin, I was watching it from behind my fingers, I was exclaiming at the telly. It was just really great fun. I think it's also a treat for fans of James Wan, as there's lots of little nods to his previous work within this film. There were some scenes that felt quite industrial, like Soho, and there were some really good subtle scares like in the original Conjuring, and the sound design and haunted house setting really reminded me of Insidious. And Malignant does a really good job of tapping into our fears, and I don't just mean that of ghosts and masked killers, but fears of our mental health, memories, our perception of reality, these things that help to define us and give us an element of safety. And Wan in Malignant explores what happens when these are taken away from us. Next up we have Shang and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Now unfortunately I didn't get to watch all the new releases of Marvel in 2021. I didn't get to watch Black Widow and I didn't watch Spider-Man No Way Home, but I have a sneaky feeling if I had seen them they probably would have been on this list as well. But as it happens, I just watched Eternals and Shang-Chi. And I think that Shang-Chi was the strongest out of the two. It's a really beautiful film visually, and it really reminded me of films like House of Flying Daggers. It had a storyline that I actually cared about and characters that I became invested in, and I think that it was a really good combination of linking events that had already happened in the Marvel Universe to introducing us to new characters going forward. And for me, it actually had some laugh out loud moments, mostly from Trevor and his creature sidekick. Those two practically stole the film for me. Next up we have The Suicide Squad. Now this was one of the greatest surprises for me last year. I was always going to watch this as it had Harley Quinn in it, it had Idris Elba in it, and it had Sylvester Stallone voicing a shark. But you know, seeing the original Suicide Squad, I wasn't expecting to be blown away by it. But I was blown away by it. This was a really good action superhero movie. It has the standard James Gunn humour and gore to it, and actually I was taken quite surprised by the level of gore in it. I was expecting it to be of the level of Suicide Squad, Birds of Prey, and then that opening scene happened and it became very clear very quickly that this film was just going to be on a completely different level. And they really nailed it this time round with the characters as well. I mean, these are some of the D-list, Z-list characters from the DC universe, but they are so well rounded and so well fleshed out that they've been some of my favourite characters to come from the recent movies. And it actually surprisingly had some moments that genuinely tugged at my heartstrings, especially to do with the character Ratcatcher 2. In fact, there's this really beautiful piece of music from the soundtrack called Ratism. I'll link it below, but it's so lovely, especially in the scene that it's used in. The Suicide Squad is just a wonderful, wacky, batshit crazy movie that is just so much fun to watch. Next up we have The Night House. Now in my last episode I said that it had been quite a while since I had a really good scare from a horror movie, and The Night House definitely delivered on that front. It builds in tension quite slowly for a while and then very quickly, very loudly switches to absolute terror. But there is always an eerie level of unease throughout the whole movie. And the use of visuals in the movie perfectly match the feelings of the lead character. The titular lake itself is so wide and engulfing like Beth's grief, and the physical absences kind of like the lack of answers that Beth has to so many of her questions. I loved the use of perception and colour and mirror images within the film, and I think that The Night House is not the most comfortable of watches. It's definitely one of those films that lingers with you after you've finished. Next up, we have No Time to Die. Now, I have been a fan of James Bond movies since I was little, and the theme songs from the films as well are usually a staple in all of my movie collections. I think that No Time to Die is an interesting way to conclude the Daniel Craig story arc. There is a comforting familiarity in the structure of James Bond films, and what No Time to Die does is just completely ignore that structure. We meet a Bond that is at a very different point in his life, one that we've not seen before. This Bond is just done. He's done with being a spy and he's done with saving the world. And another difference in this film is that the villain doesn't really have much of a presence. You don't really have that sense of looming danger from him, which is such a shame because any scene that we did get with Rami Malek was just absolute gold. But I think that I realised the reason why the villain does not have as much of a presence is because in this film, it's not about the villain, it's about Bond and it's about the end of his journey. So I'll be honest, when I first watched No Time to Die, I was left feeling really annoyed by it. I was sad as well, don't get me wrong, I was sat there crying absolute buckets, but I felt annoyed. I felt annoyed for the audience and I felt annoyed for the character himself. I felt that we had both been cheated in a way after investing so much time following this character. But then, like I do with a lot of films, I let it sit with me for a while and I thought over it again. And then thinking of it in the context of the actual character itself, the life expectancy of a 00 agent is not very long, and very few of them actually have a life outside of being a spy. And what Bond was given for however short a time was a family. He was given a woman that he loved and a child, and he got to know them, like I said, for however short a time it was. And I think that that is actually a really nice reward for Bond. And in the end, when it is his end, he's not on his own, he's not alone. He is able to go talking to the woman that he loves and knowing that he is leaving the world a safer place for both her and his daughter. So overall, I think No Time to Die was a wonderful action movie and a wonderful James Bond film. I think that it was visually beautiful with incredible cinematography and an incredible soundtrack. And after thinking about it for a while, I do think that it was a really nice, poignant way to end the Daniel Craig story arc of James Bond. But I am excited to see what the future holds for this character and this franchise. Next up, we have Free Guy. Now, this was another really big surprise for me last year. I watched it with my son thinking it would just be a bit of light-hearted fun, but I actually ended up really loving this movie. I enjoyed spotting all the YouTube, Disney franchise and gaming references, and I loved the cameos from Dwayne Johnson and Hugh Jackman, but I think my favourite cameos have to be the ones from John Krasinski and Chris Evans, just because theirs were a little bit on the cheeky side, shall we say. I think that Ryan Reynolds' leading man was really endearing and a refreshing change from his recent Deadpool-esque characters. Free Guy isn't on this list because it's the most incredible and creative piece of cinema ever made. It's on this list because it's a well-made movie that made me laugh, made me sing Mariah Carey and warmed my heart. It is 150 minutes of cotton candy innocent fun and I absolutely loved it. Next up, we have Last Night in Soho. Now, if any of you have watched any of my previous episodes where I've mentioned this movie, you will know that I absolutely love it. It was my favourite horror movie of 2021. And even though there might be movies that are technically better than it, I just connected with it on such a personal level, which I have said before, that there was no way any other film was going to knock it off that top spot. Last Night in Soho is a mixture of genres, but at its heart, it's a horror movie. And it's really nice to see Edgar Wright return to horror after his masterpiece Shaun of the Dead. They really made good use of its London setting in the film. It almost became like London was an extra character within itself. And one theme throughout the film is that of ghosts and memories of the past. And as people come and go, streets and buildings and places, they often remain for a lot longer. And the streets of Soho are what link the past and the present. And Edgar Wright really is aware of this and really utilises them throughout the movie. My favourite part of the movie has to be, hands down, the first time that Eloise goes back to the 60s and she visits the Café de Paris. It just looks so glossy and glamorous, and I know that that's what we're meant to think, but how could you not want to be there just dancing with Sandy and Jack? Next up we have The Green Knight. Now The Green Knight is my first flurry into A24 movies and I absolutely loved it. I put it on one evening and it was just the most wonderful, relaxing way to spend 2 hours. With the reduced dialogue, vibrant colours and beautiful scenery, it really helped make it feel like I was watching a piece of artwork. The Green Knight is more than just a stunning movie though. It feels like an experience and one that rewards the attentive viewer. I think that The Green Knight has some wonderful themes running through it. The question of what would we do to leave something behind, to leave a story after we're gone? What would we sacrifice to find honour? But also the inevitability of death and the opportunity of life. When I talked about The Green Knight in one of my Letterboxd recaps, I did mention that I thought that if you had a basic knowledge already of Arthurian legends and medieval England, it would definitely help you when watching this movie. And I stand by that. I don't think that it's essential to watch this film. I don't think it's essential to be able to enjoy this film. But I think that knowledge would definitely add an extra layer of enjoyment to the movie. Next up, we have The Matrix Resurrections. And I think that this quote from the second and third movies perfectly sums up this installment. There are definitely recognisable staples from the original trilogy, and the original movie score has been remixed into this film's soundtrack as well, but there are a lot of new elements that have been introduced as well. We have new characters, new rules as well within the Matrix, and new events that have happened. But I personally really liked that. I am someone who enjoys nostalgia and revisiting characters and places within movies. I liked the idea of going back and seeing what happened to the survivors after the war between the humans and the machines ended. We all know that in Matrix movies, the visuals and the special effects are exceptional, but they also add a little bit of social commentary and messages through their movies as well, and Resurrection is still doing that. I thought that it was interesting, the idea that they tried to explore that during wartime life felt a lot simpler for them, who was good and who was bad, and their goals were a lot clearer. But now within peacetime, the lines between who is good and who is bad and what they're actually striving for become blurred. There is tons of social commentary within this movie, and I think it's really clever what the film does. What the Matrix does to Neo and his friends within the movie is they trivialise their lives and the events that happened by making it a video game. But what the film actually does is something similar to our own lives, trivializing it by making it a commentary in a movie, this idea of being on a constant loop and always desiring what you want, but then also fearing that you're going to lose what you have. One of my favourite scenes in Resurrections was the montage of Neo living his life in the Matrix, where he gets up, he goes to work, he goes to the gym. Those odd little details like him laying in the bath with the duck on his head, him laughing manically, and then when he's at the gym and he's on the treadmill, I mean, he is literally running and getting nowhere. It's a very odd but very clever little scene, and Keanu Reeves really brought his A game in this movie. It was a new version of Neo, definitely. I mean, there were some points in the movie where I could see Ted, there were some points where I could see Neo, and there were some points where it felt like I was just watching Keanu himself. And the moment where Neo is back in a ship after being pulled from the Matrix a second time, and when he says the line that it felt like what they had done had been for nothing, with Keanu's delivery of that, I really felt the heaviness of that on him. Oh, and I loved the little detail of the therapist's glasses being blue, because he's like the blue pill. He's doing the same job as the pill. He's keeping Neo drugged and making him believe that the Matrix is real. Very clever, very fun. Next up, we have A Quiet Place 2. Now, I mentioned in my last episode that I am new to the A Quiet Place movies. I watched the first one earlier this year and cannot believe it took me so long to watch it. It is definitely one of my favourite horror movies now. And this is an incredible sequel that is almost just as tense and beautiful as the original one. And it was really interesting as the main family venture further out into the world, and so it allows the audience to see the wider world, to see how more people are dealing with the invasion. But they also begin to go down the similar route of The Walking Dead, where they're exploring the idea that the creatures are not the only danger out there anymore. I do think, though, unfortunately, This sequel does lose a little something from the original, and I think it's probably down to the addition of Michael Bay as a producer, just because in some scenes his action movie style was very evident and it made them border on the cheesy. But all of the actors deliver such a strong performance, including the new addition of Cillian Murphy, who's portraying so much through those eyes of his again. And finally, we have the movie I watched the most recently, Ghostbusters Afterlife. Now, I said in my Letterboxd review that I cannot put into words just how happy this movie made me. I have loved Ghostbusters since I was a little kid, and I was so excited for this one. It was directed by Jason Reitman, who is the son of Ivan Reitman, who directed the original 2 Ghostbusters. And Dan Aykroyd, Bill Murray, Ernie Hudson, Sigourney Weaver and Annie Potts all returned for their roles. The whole film was really good in my opinion, but it was in the third act when it became really strong, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that it was like catnip for people like me who love nostalgia. And at the end we had the image of the 4 original Ghostbusters stood together again. It was enough to melt the coldest heart in my opinion. It was so beautiful and poignant and so freaking heartwarming. McKenna Grace and Finn Wolfhard, 2 of the best child actors around at the moment, and Paul Rudd were all an absolute delight to watch, and Finn Wolfhard had me laughing out loud so many times in this film. But let's be honest, the 2 best moments of this movie were when Echo One's siren started up with the theme tune kicking in and the appearance of Dana Barrett in the credit scenes. Okay guys, so there you have it, my top 10, but actually 11 movies of 2021. Lots of franchise entries, lots of sequels, but we also had some incredible original pieces as well. My top 5, in no particular order, are Ghostbusters Afterlife, Last Night in Soho, No Time to Die, The Matrix Resurrections, and The Suicide Squad. So that's my last episode of the wrap-up of 2021. I have already done my most anticipated movies of 2022 and my best and worst horror movies of 2021, so make sure to check those out if you haven't already. My next episode will hopefully be my review of the new Scream movie, and I will also be doing an episode ranking all of the movies and talking about the franchise as a whole, so make sure to keep an eye out for that one. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye guys.